For more than 300 years, the dodo has stood for exactly one thing: a fat, clumsy bird, too stupid and too slow to survive contact with humans. That image is printed on lunchboxes, repeated in classrooms, and used as the go-to punchline for extinction itself, shorthand for an animal so poorly designed by nature that its disappearance felt almost inevitable, practically self-inflicted. Almost none of it holds up. Starting in 2002, a series of DNA studies has taken the dodo apart piece by piece, revealing an animal whose actual family tree, actual body, and actual timeline of disappearance look almost nothing like the caricature everyone grew up with, and ending with something even stranger: the same genetic material now being used in an active attempt to bring it back. Start with what nobody could agree on for centuries: what the dodo actually was. Dutch sailors first recorded the bird on the island of Mauritius in 1598, and within decades, naturalists back in Europe were arguing about where it belonged. Some placed it alongside ostriches, grouping it with other large, flightless birds simply because it shared that same general shape. Others linked it to vultures based on its hooked beak, or to rails based on its general build, with no genuine evidence connecting any of these guesses beyond surface appearance, since almost nobody arguing about the bird's ancestry had ever actually examined its bones firsthand. A handful of scientists eventually doubted it had ever existed at all, treating early sailors' accounts as exaggeration or myth, since by the time anyone in Europe took a serious scientific interest, the bird had already been gone for well over a century, and almost no physical remains had survived intact. That skepticism persisted until 1865, when a school teacher and naturalist named George Clark located a massive deposit of subfossil bones at a marsh called Mar au Songe on Mauritius, finally giving researchers enough physical material to study the animal seriously for the first time, more than a century and a half after the species itself had already vanished from the island entirely. Even with that discovery, complete skeletons remained almost impossibly rare. To this day, only 2 dodo skeletons made up entirely of bones from a single individual bird have ever been found, both held at the Mauritius Natural History Museum, alongside a third, less complete skeleton kept in South Africa. Even once the bones were finally in hand, the dodo's actual appearance stayed murky for another century and a half. The earliest sketches, drawn from sailors who had seen living birds firsthand, showed something lean, almost scrawny, with small, stumpy wings. Decades later, once the dodo had become a fashionable curiosity, European paintings showed something else entirely: a grotesquely fat, waddling caricature, the version that stuck for the next 300 years. Researchers now suspect those later, plumper portraits were based on overfed captive birds kept in European menageries, gorging on rich food with none of the exercise a wild dodo foraging across Mauritius would have gotten, rather than the wild animal itself. It took until 2014 for anyone to test this directly, when biologist Leon Claessens, then at the College of the Holy Cross, used 3-dimensional laser scanning on the only known complete dodo skeleton to reconstruct its actual proportions. A follow-up study several years later measured 174 individual dodo thigh bones pulled from the vast Mar au Songe collection, the largest sample of dodo remains ever analyzed for body mass. Both pointed to the same conclusion: a leaner, more upright, more athletic bird weighing around 12 kilograms, roughly 5 times heavier than the largest living pigeon species, but built for an active life foraging through forest undergrowth, not the bloated cartoon plastered across children's books for 3 centuries. Even the dodo's plumage may have been misremembered along with its waistline, with researchers now suggesting a darker gray to brown coloring rather than the pale blue-gray most illustrations still default to. A detail pieced together from the handful of surviving contemporary paintings believed to have been drawn from live or freshly dead specimens, rather than copied secondhand from other artists' earlier work. If you are finding this interesting, be sure to subscribe to understand more DNA from the past. Getting the body right was only the beginning. Getting the family tree right required actual genetic material, and that didn't arrive until 2002, when researcher Beth Shapiro, then working at Oxford, published a study in the journal Science that finally settled the question centuries of guesswork had never resolved. Shapiro's team extracted mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down through the maternal line and often better preserved than the DNA found in a cell's main nucleus, from a specimen held at the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, the same collection that houses the soft tissue remains believed to have partly inspired Lewis Carroll's Dodo character in Alice in Wonderland. The team compared that genetic material against samples from 37 separate species of pigeons and doves, including a preserved specimen of the Solitaire, a related extinct flightless bird from the nearby island of Rodrigues that had spent just as long being mysteriously misclassified as the dodo itself, sometimes even mistaken by earlier writers for the same species despite living on a separate island roughly 350 miles away. The results were unambiguous. The dodo was not a distant relative of an ostrich, a vulture, or a rail, the leading guesses that had circulated for more than 2 centuries among naturalists working with nothing more than a skull and a handful of old sketches to go on. It was a pigeon, full stop, nested firmly inside the same family that includes the birds pecking at breadcrumbs in any city park on Earth. Its closest living relative turned out to be the Nicobar pigeon, a small iridescent bird found on islands thousands of miles away across the Indian Ocean, with the two lineages splitting apart roughly 42 million years ago, long before Mauritius itself had even been settled by any bird species at all. That single result forced a complete rewrite of the dodo's entire origin story. Its ancestors weren't some separate, primitive lineage of large, flightless birds that had always looked roughly the way the dodo did. They were small, capable flyers, ordinary pigeons that likely island hopped across chains of islands and underwater ridges scattered throughout the Indian Ocean before finally reaching Mauritius, a volcanic island with no native land mammals and no natural predators of any kind waiting for them. Once there, that same small flying pigeon, freed from the pressures that keep smaller birds small and airborne, and with abundant food available year-round on the forest floor, grew larger, lost the ability to fly entirely, and eventually became the 3-foot-tall animal Dutch sailors stumbled onto in 1598. The same basic pattern, a small flying ancestor arriving on a predator-free island and slowly abandoning flight altogether, produced the Rodrigues Solitaire independently on a completely different nearby island, meaning this exact transformation from small flying pigeon to giant flightless bird happened not once, but twice in the same small cluster of Indian Ocean islands. The most famous symbol of extinction on Earth was, at the genetic level, simply a pigeon that ran out of reasons to fly. The dodo's family tree wasn't the only fixed point that turned out to be wrong. Its extinction date was too. The dodo's disappearance is commonly dated to 1662, the year of its last widely confirmed sighting, reported by a shipwrecked Dutch sailor named Volkert Everts on a small islet off the Mauritius coast, at a point when the species had already become rare enough that its previous confirmed sighting had happened a full 24 years earlier. In 2003, researchers David Roberts and Andrew Solow applied a statistical method, built using a mathematical distribution originally designed to estimate extinction dates for species whose final confirmed sighting likely happened well before their true disappearance, directly to the dodo's full historical sighting record. Their model placed the species' actual extinction closer to 1690, nearly 3 decades after the date most textbooks still print, treating the 1681 account of an English sailor named Benjamin Harry, long dismissed by historians as unreliable, as a plausible late sighting rather than a mistake. A follow-up study the next year added further support, using newly examined hunting records kept by Isaac Johannes Lamotius, the island's Dutch governor, between 1685 and 1688, which showed dodo specimens were still being regularly caught and cached during those exact years. That second analysis, using a similar statistical approach, arrived at an extinction estimate of 1693, differing from Roberts and Solow's figure by only 3 years, while narrowing the range of uncertainty considerably. The dodo, in other words, likely survived quietly for decades after the moment history had already assumed it was gone, hunted and eaten in numbers steady enough to leave a paper trail, even as the wider world had already stopped paying attention. The underlying logic behind that correction turned out to matter well beyond this one bird. A species this rare was never going to be spotted and documented every single year right up until its final individual died, since sightings of an animal already down to a scattered handful naturally become sparse and unreliable long before the population actually reaches zero. Treating the last confirmed sighting as the literal moment of extinction, the way popular history had always done with the dodo, systematically underestimates how long a dying population can actually persist. Unnoticed, in the corners of an island, nobody was watching closely enough. That same statistical logic would later be applied to other uncertain extinctions entirely, turning a technique first built around solving one bird's disappearance into a standard tool used across ecology and paleontology for estimating when any hard-to-observe species actually vanished, from birds not seen in decades to marine life last confirmed only through a handful of scattered fishing records. The dodo, in a strange twist, ended up lending its own disappearance to help scientists study every other uncertain extinction that followed it. Subscribe to not miss the next one. The most recent DNA story surrounding the dodo isn't about reading its past at all. It's about trying to reverse its future. In 2022, Shapiro, now a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, joined the De-Extinction company Colossal Biosciences as a scientific advisor, bringing 2 decades of dodo genetic research directly into an active revival attempt. Because birds develop inside a shell in a way that makes cloning, the technique used to create Dolly the sheep, essentially impossible, the approach works entirely differently. Researchers compare the dodo's genome against its closest living relative, the Nicobar pigeon, and its closest extinct relative, the Rodrigues solitaire, to identify the specific genetic variants likely responsible for dodo-like traits: its size, its downy feathers, its heavy, hooked beak. The plan is to edit those variants directly into Nicobar pigeon reproductive cells, known as primordial germ cells, then implant those edited cells into gene-edited chicken embryos, modified so they carry pigeon reproductive material instead of their own, effectively turning a chicken into a living incubator for pigeon eggs and sperm. Once those chickens mature, the idea is that they would breed and produce eggs, carrying the edited Nicobar pigeon genetics rather than chicken genetics at all, allowing scientists to hatch and raise the resulting pigeon lineage birds directly, entirely bypassing the impossible task of trying to clone a dodo from degraded, centuries-old genetic material that no longer contains anything close to a complete, functional genome. By September of 2025, the team had announced real, concrete progress. The first successful long-term culturing of pigeon primordial germ cells in history, gene-edited chicken surrogates built specifically to carry them, a live breeding colony of Nicobar pigeons established in Texas, and freshly sequenced, high-quality reference genomes for the Nicobar pigeon, the Rodrigues solitaire, and a distant, critically endangered relative called the tooth-billed pigeon, a bird from Samoa not confirmed on camera since 2013, and itself considered a strong candidate for the same genetic comparison work. None of this guarantees a living dodo at the end of it. Independent scientists, including geneticist Parwinder Kaur, have publicly cautioned that claims this significant deserve full peer review before being treated as settled fact, rather than being announced first through company press releases and funding announcements, a criticism that has followed Colossal's other high-profile projects as well. Even Colossal's own team acknowledges that editing a pigeon cell to carry dodo-associated genes is a very different achievement than producing an actual living, breeding bird capable of surviving back on Mauritius, and outside critics argue that whatever eventually hatches, if anything does, will be a heavily modified Nicobar pigeon carrying a handful of dodo traits, not a genetically identical dodo brought back unchanged from 300 years of absence. Line up all three findings, and the popular image of the dodo doesn't survive contact with any of them. It was never a slow, stupid, oversized failure of nature waiting around to go extinct, a punchline that only ever made sense because nobody had bothered to check it against the animal's actual bones. Its actual body was lean and active, misrepresented for centuries by paintings of overfed zoo animals rather than the wild bird itself. Its actual ancestry traces directly back to a small, ordinary flying pigeon, not some separate branch of flightless giants that had always looked the way the dodo did. Its actual disappearance likely stretched decades beyond the date carved into every reference book, with dodos surviving in dwindling, quietly hunted numbers long after history had already closed the book on them. And unlike almost any other extinct animal ever covered in this kind of story, the genetic material that finally exposed all of this is now being actively rebuilt, cell by cell, inside the reproductive tissue of its closest living relative, in an ongoing project that has already produced real, verified results, but not yet a single living bird. 3 centuries of the laziest joke in natural history, a story everyone assumed was already fully known and settled, has instead spent the last 20 years being rewritten piece by piece by the one thing bones alone could never provide on their own: its own DNA, extracted from a museum drawer, decoded, and finally allowed to tell the truth.